RetroFest Arkansas was last week, and I went crazy trying to find Nintendo 64 games that I don't have in my collection. I took a whole list and I wandered around and ended up finding some good stuff, but did I spend too much money, or do you think this was worth it? Stick around to the end to find out, but enough about that. Let's go ahead and head back to Arkansas and see what I ended up finding. So of course I had to make my way into RetroFest itself, and boy, on Saturday morning this place was absolutely packed, which is awesome for Rick and all he did. But enough about that. It's time to get to game hunting here. This first booth I stumbled upon, I found a bunch of games over here and I kind of looked through it a little bit. I ended up finding Brunswick Circuit Pro Bowling, which I don't have, as well as Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. I looked a little bit more through this stack here, and then I ultimately also ended up getting Superman 64, which is not a great game, but also not one that I had in my collection. Now, this was priced at $45, and they ended up giving all three of those to me for $40, which is absolutely awesome. Then I made my way to this next booth, which was from Woodman Classics. Shout out to Woodman for this deal and everything. We talked for a bit. He's absolutely awesome. He has a great channel, so check that out if you haven't already. But while I was looking through his booth, I found another Wayne Gretzky game that I actually didn't have in my collection, which is kind of surprising considering I love hockey. I looked through his booth a little bit more in this bin, and I did end up finding one other game that's probably a game I should have passed on, but I ended up getting both of these games here. I ended up finding a Madden that I didn't actually have here. It was Madden 2002. And then he said, when I was checking out, he was like, okay, these are my buddy's games, but my games are on the other side of this booth. And if you check over there in the bin, there's a bunch of loose, like cheaper sports games. So he said, come over here. He showed me some here, and I said immediately, I've got to have that Pokemon Puzzle League. And so he went ahead and grabbed that off and held it to the side for me. And then I walked around the corner here and started digging through these bins, which was just absolutely awesome. Like I said, I was looking for a few games that I don't have. And I don't have Madden 2001, so I ended up grabbing that from him as well. So I dug through this bin a little bit more, and ultimately I ended up just getting Madden 2001 and Pokemon Puzzle League from him, which was absolutely awesome. I didn't even haggle him. His prices were good, so I ended up getting all those games right away there. And then I made my way to this booth where I found a bunch of like heavy hitters right here. That's where I ended up finding Harvest Moon 64. But then around the corner was a ton more kind of cheaper games, if you will, for the Nintendo 64. So I looked through a little bit there, and I ended up finding two games that were definitely well worth it. I kind of looked for a little bit and didn't find anything. Then I ended up finding this copy of Castlevania that I grabbed. And I looked a little bit more, and that's where I ended up actually grabbing Vigilante 8 or V8 here. I don't have any of these games, so I ended up saying, hey, this is like $125. What can you do? And they said, what about 110? And so we made a deal for those games, which was absolutely awesome. Definitely well worth it there. I wandered around some more here because this place was absolutely huge, and I came across this table that had a few games here and there, but nothing I absolutely had to have, so I continued on. I looked for a little bit, but that's all I found. Then I found this booth that did have a bunch of awesome complete in-box games, but unfortunately, none of the games on my list that I needed to pick up were actually here, which I was kind of shocked by, to be honest with you. So I continued on to this next booth where I found a bunch of Nintendo 64 games here, and all of them, most of them had top labels, but for the most part, these were like games you probably weren't interested in picking up, which was unfortunate. But for my list, I figured that would be great. I found this Castlevania game right after I already bought one, but I didn't find anything else that was on my list that absolutely shocked me, because usually I can find at least one game, because there's a bunch of like miscellaneous sports games that I don't actually have already. So I dug and dug, looking, hoping to find something here, and I didn't find anything. So I continued on to this booth where they had all the Nintendo 64 games nicely bagged up. Didn't find anything. Then I found this booth from Nerd Nation. Shout out to Michael from Nerd Nation. He had a bin of sports games, and they were really cheap, but I dug through this thing for like 5 minutes, and none of the games I needed were on there. So unfortunately, I struck out. I saw a few box games here, but nothing I had to have on my list, so I continued on here, where I did stumble upon a bunch of Nintendo 64 games here in this corner, even some Japanese ones, but again, unfortunately, this booth didn't have anything that I needed. I saw a few boxed games here. I already have both of these sports games, and then I ended up spotting this Donkey Kong 64 t-shirt that was still sealed, which is absolutely awesome. Immediately when I saw it, I had to show it to my wife. Then a Banjo-Kazooie still sealed, and even Super Bowling, which is a very, very expensive game, complete in the box there. But then I made my way over to this booth from Mighty Mike, where I looked through because he had a ton of Nintendo 64 games, and that's where I actually ended up finding 3 games that I did not have that were on my list, and that ended up being a pretty decent chunk of money. I spent like $250 here. I got Rat Attack and Chameleon Twist and Chameleon Twist 2. Those were definitely well worth it for 90, 80, and 30 bucks. We made a deal and he knocked a little off, but quite a bit of money there spent. And then I made my way to this booth where you could see on the left there was some with manuals and then just some other games, but nothing I had to have. I turned around and spotted this Zelda Ocarina of Time in this little case there, and then on the other side of that case was a ton of box games, but unfortunately nothing I had to have, so I continued on. Unfortunately, I figured maybe since there were a bunch of games here, I could find something. I even looked in this kind of plexiglass case over to the left here, and as well as they did have bangers, they did not have anything that I needed on my list, so I left that booth and continued on pretty quickly because I didn't see anything. And that's where I came across this booth where I found some really cool stuff. No Nintendo 64 games. However, after I looked at the games, underneath were a bunch of VHSs where I found this Diddy Kong Racing VHS, which I already have. And then I found 2 sports VHS tapes for the Nintendo 64. One had Jet Force Gemini and DK64 on it, and the other one had the basketball and the football game. So I ended up buying both of those because those things are absolutely awesome. And anytime I can find those that I don't already have, I've got to pick them up. But then I made my way to this booth that was like 2 or 3 booths down. And that's where I actually hit kind of a little bit of a jackpot because there were some good deals to be had in this booth. Now, right off the bat, you see me digging in this tub down below. There were games laid out on both of these tables, but when I saw a ton of Nintendo 64 games under here, I kind of dug through it. I almost got this NFL Blitz game, but then I realized I'm pretty sure I have it, and it wasn't on my list, so I ended up passing on it. But man, was I surprised to find this many awesome games. Starting off, I did end up finding Fighting Force 64 here, which is definitely great for 25 bucks. And then I kind of kept looking, and I found Goemon's Great Adventure for 75. Now, it does have a bad label on it, but this game goes for about $110, so that was definitely a good deal, and I even picked up a Powerpuff Girls game from them as well, so I made a really good deal. 120 bucks for 100, definitely well worth it. But then, this booth at Charlie's Reality Retro, I ended up spotting this Nintendo 64 bag from afar. And I said, hey, how much? We were talking, and then I was like, how much is that? I don't know if I want it yet, but how much is it? And he's like, all right, 50, but I can give you a deal. And so we ended up going for 40 bucks, which is insane. I saw a orange and this Pikachu Nintendo 64 there at that table. But then I continued on to this booth where I stumbled upon a bunch of games, but unfortunately nothing on my list, which is kind of a bummer. Cyber Tiger was on my list, but I'm not trying to spend that much money on a game box that I'm probably not going to play more than once in my lifetime. So I went to this next booth, and while they did have a bunch of awesome games here, unfortunately, there was nothing I had to have for the collection or the list, which is kind of a bummer, but it is what it is. There's places where you're going to find things, and there's going to be other booths where you don't. I looked around this one last place and ended up spotting a few games here, but when I looked at them, I didn't really find anything that I needed to pick up. As you can tell, I bought a ton of stuff, so let's go ahead and talk about it now that I'm back home, talk about everything I picked up, and I'll even show you how much these are actually going for on price charting, and you can determine whether you think I got a good deal or not. So let's just go ahead and start off with the games, because I want to get through those because there's some pretty awesome stuff. That first stop that I ended up stopping at, I ended up finding Circuit Pro Bowling, which is a bowling game, but honestly, I don't know. It's not a game I had on my list, so I picked that up. Then I ended up picking up Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. I used to have this in my collection, but when I was looking through trying to see if I still did, for whatever reason, I couldn't find the game, and I still had the top label, so I never added that, I guess. And last but not least, at that first booth, I ended up finding Superman 64. Now, I know this is the worst game ever, but if you want to see me review this, comment down below. And then I made my way to Woodman Classics booth, where I got 3 really cheap games and 1 pretty awesome game that I'm super stoked upon. First off was Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey 98. Another Wayne Gretzky game that surprisingly I didn't have, followed by 2 Madden games that he gave me a deal on, Madden 2001 and Madden 2002. To be honest with you, I have no real need to play these. I might play them once and never again. But a game I definitely see myself playing a bunch of is Pokemon Puzzle League. I've never actually played this before. I've never owned the game, so I've seen a little bit about it, and this seems to be right up my alley, so I'm definitely stoked to play this in my Nintendo 64. And then we get to the stack of some more heavy hitters here, starting off with Castlevania. I'm a big Castlevania fan, so I'm excited to play this. From what I've heard, this game's not that crazy, but I figured I have to pick it up for the list. And next was Vigilante 8, or V8 as I always called it as a kid. I never actually owned this game, but I remember renting it like 100 times, and my parents were like, really? You're gonna rent that game again? But every time I got this, it was a ton of fun, and I absolutely loved it. And last but not least, from that booth was Harvest Moon 64, which I think my wife will enjoy this more than I will, to be honest with you, but another game that I had to have for the list. And then I made it to the booth where I spent the most money on only 3 games, and that ended up being Chameleon Twist for $30, Chameleon Twist 2 for $80. Both of these games look like they would be a ton of fun, so I'm glad to have grabbed these to play them. I can't wait to see if they're actually worth it or not. And last but not least was Rat Attack for $90, which is a lot of money, but we ended up working a deal. I think this was $200, and I ended up paying like $170 or something like that. Honestly, I don't remember too much because a lot happened last weekend. But then I made my way to this booth, which was the last booth where I got Nintendo 64 games, and I ended up grabbing Fighting Force for $25, followed by the Powerpuff Girls Chemical Extraction, which this game looks like it might be one of those games that when I buy it, I'm probably going to enjoy it, so that's pretty cool. And last but not least, a more expensive game is Goemon's Great Adventure. As you can see, like I said earlier, there is a tear in the label, but they had it for $75, and I think we ended up getting these games. They were $120 for $100, so I was definitely excited to do that. And that is all of the games I ended up buying from the Nintendo 64 at RetroFest. However, I bought 2 really cool VHS tapes. This one had sports games on it, like Baseball 180 and Kobe Bryant, which was totally awesome. And then this one looks like it has Jet Force Gemini and Donkey Kong 64 on it, which I think is absolutely crazy. I'm kind of surprised this one doesn't have more like branding to it, but either way, when I saw these 2, I knew I had to pick them up to go in my collection because I don't have these 2. And what I think is probably the craziest thing that I'm most excited about, other than to play the games, is this Nintendo 64 fanny pack. They had it for $50. We ended up talking, and I ended up getting this thing for $40. I felt like when I saw this, I was like, okay, that thing is insane, and I love collecting bags like this. So when I saw this, I knew I had to pick it up. But after all of this, if you've made it this far, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I've got about 200 Nintendo 64 games, and the whole collection only has 296 games, sorry. And I think I might start a series where I try to complete the whole Nintendo 64 collection. So if you want to see me try to do that, leave a comment down below and say, start that Nintendo 64 collection. I'm kind of teasing it a little bit with this video. I wanted to kind of see how people would react, and I definitely think there's some really expensive games that I'm missing and some not so expensive games in my collection. So I kind of want to know what you guys think. Would that be interesting, or would you not want to see me do that? Comment down below and let me know, because I'm definitely excited. But this is year 2 of RetroFest put on by Retro Rick. He invited me out here to Conway, Arkansas. I had an absolute blast hanging out with everyone that I saw. Shout out to them. You know who you are. If we talked at all, shout out to you. I had a blast talking to friends that I haven't seen in a while and some cool people while I was there. I can't wait for next year. Shout out to Retro Rick for putting on an awesome convention and for bringing me out, because it was definitely awesome. But I've got a lot of Nintendo 64 games I've got to clean, test, and then label, because I put in labels on mine to make them look nice. So I got to get out of here. So check that video out if you haven't already, and comment down below what you think was my best pickup from this video. Was it this Nintendo 64 bag, the VHS tapes, Goemon's Great Adventure, or maybe something like Rat Attack, which is an expensive game? Comment down below and let me know, but I gotta get out of here, so check that video out if you haven't already.